see. Good morning, everybody. It's 10:01, and I'm Angela Tsukiji with the North State. I'd like to say thank you to all of you for joining us on this Monday week. So thank you for your time, and also thank you for being very important to us. We have what's even more important, this topic, right? This Title 24 and the new code changes that are coming up in 2023. And one of the things that I wanted to let y'all know that the BIA will be doing a series of presentations that we did called Countdown to 2020 at that time. We have a committee already formed, and we're going to start meeting in January, with our first program being on Thursday, March 10th. That will be our first in-person breakfast blend event. March 10th, 7:30 to 9:30 at the Hilton Arden West. And that will today's sort of like a kickoff, but that will be the official first edition of our countdown to whatever we decide to call it at that time. So anyway, thank you again for being here. And then also, I would like to thank ConSol. They've been doing these sessions down in Southern California because Southern California Edison company down there has sponsored presentations for the builders down there. And so we kind of snuck in and said, hey, can you do one up here for our members? And they were more than happy to. And so that's why ConSol is here today. And Tom Payne is the presenter extraordinaire of this topic at ConSol. And then Ben is here the assistance that he needs. But with that, I'd love to turn the table over to you, Tom.
Great, thanks.
Thank
you. Again, I'm Tom Payne from ConSol in Sacramento, presenting here in person in Roseville for the first time in I think 2 years. So today we're going to talk about upcoming building energy code changes, as well as just sort of electrification generally, and kind of what that landscape is. This presentation is sponsored by SoCal Edison, as they work towards, achieving their goals for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and all electric construction is part of their strategy, as well as a statewide strategy for doing that. So we'll go over what that looks like and why that is. Okay. Just a little overview of ConSol if folks don't know us already. We do a lot of energy code related monitoring, tracking. We do some particular modeling for folks just to help make sure we understand how the code is working and how the state's various software programs are allowing for different functionalities and making sure they all work. That's something that comes up a lot, is making sure those things like CVAC actually does what it's meant to do. And otherwise, they're helping people solve problems, and that's kind of ConSol is. And of course, if you're curious further, visit our website, consol.org. So electrification is the big topic. And as a lot of folks will remember, this isn't a new topic, right? California used to build quite a few electric homes, 40, 50 years ago even. And that stopped. And we think about why that stopped, and the big reason it stopped is because the state created new policy that they wanted to support the electric grid, and they figured the best way to do that was by encouraging folks to use natural gas wherever possible. And so for the last 20 years or so, that's what the policy has been, is to use natural gas as much as possible. And so now we're kind of flipping the script on that and going back to all electric construction. That's not super common in California, but it's fairly common across the country. So in terms of equipment, we're talking about water heaters and space conditioning. That stuff is definitely out there and available. These aren't new technologies, they're just not super common here. So builder concerns. So out front, we'll talk about what's driving the state's policy right now. And so the big kind of overarching thing is the state has to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions to net zero by 2045, which includes reducing grid emissions to zero by 2045. And that's sort of the important component of electrification, is even though if you build an electric home today, it wouldn't be zero emissions. By being electric today, it'll become zero emissions in the future because the grid will become zero emissions. And that's sort of the thought that underpins this policy, is by going all electric today, we're sort of creating homes that'll just, without doing anything, just become zero emissions in the future. Just a little bit more on what the current policy and law is on this. There's plenty of things going on in terms of the state doing proper accounting for greenhouse gas emissions, working on what things get included in those emissions targets. One of the things that's come up is 30 years ago, right, CFCs were banned, right, because they're depleting the ozone layer. And it turns, and so sort of global warming policy has been to reduce emissions compared to a 1990 baseline. And it turned out that because of that change in CFC use, because there is this, it meant that there's this huge spike in emissions in 1990 and then tailed off really hard in the early 90s. And so if you compare to a 1990 baseline, it turns out we've actually beaten those 40% reduction targets pretty handily already. So the state's been finding ways to essentially make it harder to meet their targets because they want to shoot for a higher goal. That's one thing that's been happening there. We know that electric cars are coming, right? That the state has mandated that only electric cars be sold after 2035, which has implications for EV charging. And you know, and so yeah, this is the landscape, right? Electric cars are coming. Electrification is driving the state's policy on buildings because they found that to be sort of the simplest, easiest way to get to zero emissions in new construction. And they're going to keep going down that path. And so how they get down that path starts with one of the first major updates in the 2022 code, right? That's going into effect in January 2023. So in the new code, the state has set, so we've already had EDR1, right? That's been our energy compliance metric for quite a while now. So that's your energy design rating, right? So we've had that, and that's what it's been. But now we're going to have two EDR scores. We're going to have the EDR1, which is a new metric, and that's going to measure the emissions related to the energy that the home consumes. And then we're going to have EDR2, which is the historic actual energy efficiency measure that we have been using. What EDR1 is going to do is it's essentially going to set a cap. It's going to set a limit on how high the emissions for that home can be. You can do whatever you like in that home, right? We're still talking about a performance approach, but it has to be under that threshold. That threshold is going to be based on a home that has at least one heat pump appliance in it, either a water heater or a space heater. And but yeah, so that's what it's going to be. CBEC is adding another column. We're going to have our EDR1, which is measuring emissions, EDR2, which is our typical efficiency measurement. And this is going to stick around. This isn't just their measurement for this code cycle. Because the way they've set up EDR1, all I have to do for the next code cycle is just change what's in that baseline, and then they're going to ratchet down, right, that emissions cap for a home. And so it only takes a flip of the switch for them to say add to heat pumps into the house to just keep driving that down. And so that's going to be the compliance tool that they use to get homes to all electric. So right, so like I said, EDR1 comes in with the cap, and that's based on having one kind of heat pump or another in the home. And that's going to depend where you are in the state, right? So we got climate zones 3, 4, 10, 13, 14. They're going to get heat pump space conditioning. It's essentially a mandatory requirement. Theoretically, if you have a heat pump space conditioner, you should be able to, through envelope improvements, should be able to meet that emissions cap with a gas furnace, but it's going to require you to do some envelope upgrades in order to keep that total energy consumption down. And that works essentially because these are low heating demand zones. And so there's not going to be a lot of gas consumption in total. But if you get a water heater, which is the entire rest of the state, if that's the requirement in your baseline, envelope isn't going to affect how that water heater performs. And so you're not going to have a means to trade that off. If the water heater is the baseline requirement in your climate zone, that's what you're going to have to put in the house. So like, that's the one thing to understand up front is that a lot of the state is simply going to have to be putting in heat pump water heaters for homes permitted starting January 2023. So that's, folks want to be creative, and then they're in those places where they have a heat pump space heater requirement. You have some options and some flexibility. It's going to cost you though. We're looking at somewhere $2,000 to $4,000 in terms of trade-offs for all of those improvements to meet that the electric heat pump performance versus a gas furnace. And this is just kind of going over how different those are. So, I mean, the idea being that with the EDR1, like that 10-point gap, right? That's how much a heat pump is doing on emissions compared to a gas furnace. And it's definitely true. Like when we talk about meeting these emissions goals, a gas house compared to an all-electric house built today, it's going to have about half, maybe a third of the emissions of a mixed fuel house if it's on all electric, with the electric grid the way it is right now. California's grid is already pretty clean, somewhere in the 50-55% zero carbon. So an all-electric house already has much, much lower emissions, and again, is targeted to become zero emissions by 2045. Some of those options that add up to that $2,000 to $4,000 range, things you might think about doing if you want to keep a gas furnace, putting on some, going 2x6 walls, continuous exterior insulation, just getting thicker in the attic, higher efficiency air conditioner. I mean, pretty obvious when it comes to efficiency improvements, but all things that cost more money. Like it's just sort of a linear, it's going to cost more money if you want to do that. Other possible options, theoretically, you can also do solar hot water. That's even more expensive, and I don't know. I mean, we don't see a lot of people doing that. I don't know if anybody in here is doing that online, but if you are, then maybe those folks have a few more options if the thought that's already kind of part of your playbook. But otherwise, it's not something we generally recommend, because compared to even say a heat pump water heater, you're going to be spending $3,000 or $4,000 more to do the solar, and you're not going to get anything really for that. I mean, that's just kind of the way that shakes up. In the future, 2025, we're expecting to see a de facto all electric requirement. They've got one heat pump in there now, and all they have to do is bring that emissions cap down just a little bit, and it'll make it effectively impossible to comply with gas, unless you got something really fancy going on. Maybe you've got cogeneration, maybe you've got ground source heat pumps, maybe you've got passive house. I mean, things like that are what you're going to need to be able to keep going with gas in the future. You're going to have to be really high performance. And for most folks, that's just not a practical option. And just on that 2025 note, to just point out how not far away that is, just 2 weeks ago with CBIA, I was on a call with the Codes and Standards Group, which is the group of folks that the utilities pay to develop codes in the interim cycle. So they've already started writing that 2025 code. They're doing it right now. So that's gearing up, and that's happening today. So I know we like to think of that being a long way from now, but it really isn't.
Quick question.
Yeah.
As far as the code's concerned, when it's looking at emission standards, is it looking at it from like an area perspective? Like if you've got some areas that are, I mean, I don't know how specific they're doing it. looking at source energy or looking at site?
Source, yeah.
Okay.
And they're looking at source, and they're going to look at the localized grid mix, so whatever your service providers for that territory are. So there's some variation, but it won't. It's not enough variation because everybody has the same renewable portfolio standards to meet. So the differences in emissions between the areas isn't very high. Okay, so we know those things are coming. We know heat pump water heaters essentially unavoidable. Heat pump space heaters, it's going to be expensive to avoid them, and you don't need to. Is really the short version. When it comes to actually switching these things over, it's probably not going to cost you any money. There's a good chance you're going to be able to save money by building all electrical. First part, right? Heat pump space heater takes up less space, right, than an air conditioner or furnace because you only have one unit, not two. So that's one thing. You don't need venting, right, because you don't have any combustion going on. With a water heater, you may need more space, right, because you have, it's a tanked water heater, so it's bigger than a tankless. If it's in the garage, you don't have to worry about the air. You have garage space. If it's going in a utility closet, then you have a little bit of a concern because you need about 4x4 space to allow enough free air for the heat pump water heater to work. So that's a design consideration to have in mind. Dryer. So this is one that comes up, and I'm not really sure where this is going to land. A lot of folks want to sell you on heat pump dryers. I don't know if anybody has tried one of these. They're out there, they work, they're expensive, and they're fairly slow even compared to just an electric resistance dryer. And we've seen in a lot of cases where people put them in that homeowners would just run them on resistance even though they have heat pumps in them because it just takes too long to use the heat pump. An electric resistance dryer costs about the same as a gas dryer. So I figure, at the end of the day, that's probably what most people are going to end up using. It's just a dryer because they're cheaper. People are already familiar with those. Obviously, they cost a little bit more money to run compared to a heat pump dryer. But at the end of the day, you're talking about over a year, the difference might be $20, $25. So I don't think anybody's going to really notice. In multifamily, it gets a little more blended because the larger scale heat pump water heating systems can be a little more complex and expensive. The heat pump water heater compared to a tankless is more expensive. It's about 3 times the cost. But again, balanced against not needing venting. And then you're also, of course, potentially avoiding putting gas lines in your streets and avoiding that infrastructure, which has some other potential savings. There's, of course, the question, how much that savings is from avoiding the gas infrastructure. 2 years ago, if you asked PG&E, they'd tell you to save somewhere $5,000 to $10,000 per house by avoiding that gas infrastructure. We went out, actually looked at the contracts that people had with PG&E, looked at the contracts people had with their trenching contractors, and at the cost of materials and labor, and found that it was something in the range $1,400 to $1,500 a house was the total savings by avoiding gas lines in the neighborhoods. Now, part of the reason it's so cheap is because those line extensions are subsidized by the utility companies right now. And you're getting somewhere $1,700 to maybe $2,100 by putting those gas lines in. Those CPUC is rulemaking right now to get rid of those subsidies. So there's a fair chance that by the end of next year, those will be gone. Without those, we're looking at about $3,000 per house cost of bringing gas in. And that's to the meter, right? That's not plumbing inside the house. That's just the neighborhood infrastructure. How does it affect business? This is not a great example. This does relate to the fact that this is sponsored by SCE. So this is, a Los Angeles example. For Sacramento, An all-electric house, you're looking at an added cost per year of utilities somewhere around $250 more compared to natural gas. That's based on utility rates from the summer. In the meantime, we have seen gas prices going up faster than electric prices, so that gap is a little bit smaller right now. If you're in SMUD territory, though, if you're in SMUD territory, the electric house is about $400 cheaper to run. And SMUD will give you about $5,000 for building an all-electric house. So if you're in SMUD territory, it's a much easier choice because the customer is going to save money on their bills, and you can get cash directly from SMUD for the time being. So that's something to really keep in mind. SMUD has, far and away the most generous subsidies for all-electric building right now. So talking about homeowner perspectives and preferences. So like I said, the default policy has been gas for homes, which has meant tankless gas water heaters, which has meant selling home buyers on the idea of continuous on-demand hot water, which is what tankless water heaters do. And now that option is going to go away. And now we're going back to tank water heaters that can run out of hot water and can get cold water to the tap if you, have a bunch of teenagers all showering in the morning or whatever your routine is. And that's essentially unavoidable, right? That's just the nature of having a tanked water heater. But most people have had one before. You understand the idea that you can only have a shower for so long, right? You can't be in there for 2 hours. But people are used to that. It's not that big of a deal. The recovery time on a heat pump water heater is slower than an older, like a resistance water heater or a gas tank water heater. So sizing is something to consider, right? If you would have put in a 50-gallon gas, maybe you want to put in a 60, 70, 80-gallon heat pump water heater, just to make sure that there is enough overhead so people aren't running out of hot water all the time. Something to keep in mind, think in terms of your bedrooms, number of bedrooms and that kind of thing, right? So maybe 50 is good for 2, and think about moving up from there. But heat pump water heaters are available. They're not super common. We've talked to the manufacturers. They're confident that the supply chain is going to be there with the code flip. What I would say is nobody can really guarantee that. And if you're building in locations where there's going to be a heat pump water heater requirement, you probably want to talk to your purchasing folks, make sure everybody's aware, because that requirement is going to be pretty hard to avoid. So just something to keep in mind, because right now in California, we're talking about maybe 2% of all new homes are all electric. And when the code goes into effect in January, we're going to be looking at, maybe 70% of new homes are going to be required to have heat pump water heaters. So there's going to be a real sharp spike in demand. So just something to be aware of there. In terms of cost, this is just some comparisons that the state wanted to make. I don't necessarily agree this is accurate because you do have to think about sizing a little differently with heat pump water heaters compared to tankless. So I would suggest that 1,800 is probably a more reliable cost for the water heater, for the heat pump water heater. But again, venting, those things, you don't have roof penetrations or any of that. So, those costs kind of offset. In terms of heat pumps for HVAC, they're not super expensive. We've seen prices pretty widely varying. And we haven't necessarily nailed down exactly why that is, because there are plenty of heat pumps being installed across the South in the United States, but just not in California. So it seems like it's just, lack of demand in the state is making them artificially higher. So we would expect the cost for heat pump HVAC in the state to come down fairly quickly once those requirements go into place. The other thought behind that being that because they're more common in other parts of the country, the manufacturers already have manufacturing lines for those tools. They're already ready to go. There's not as much switching or anything like that for manufacturers to worry about when it comes to heat pump space heaters. Clothes dryer, already went over that. The advantage to the heat pump dryer, again, is just that it's cheaper to run compared to a resistance dryer, with the offset that it's a little slower. Something to think about, maybe trial it, maybe have it as an option for folks. Cooktops. So everybody loves gas stoves. We know that, right? This has always been the topic. And how do we sell people on not having it? A lot of the argument there is based on the idea that gas stoves cause a lot of indoor air pollution, a lot of particulate air pollution, a lot of nitrous dioxide. And that's not great. We know that it causes asthma at a pretty high prevalence. We know that it does cause some actual health issues, though that mostly happens in smaller homes and more low-income areas, apartments, those places. If you have proper ventilation, the health concerns aren't as dramatic, because if you're running the range hood, then it's going to do a decent job of getting that stuff out. The bigger issue is that people often don't do it. They think that's just for when you've lit something on fire by accident, and that happens quite a lot. So there are indoor air quality benefits to electric cooking. The main drive has been to sell induction over electric resistance stoves. The idea here being that, we're working against this really high desire perspective for gas stoves. People really like them. They have this really positive idea of what a gas stove is and what it means to be a home chef and all this stuff. So the idea with the induction stoves is that they actually perform really well. They work better in terms of heating things up than resistance-based stovetops do. They can boil water faster. And because they work with electromagnetism, the whole thing is that it has to be a conductive material for it to get warm. So if you have an inductive cooktop and you leave the burner on and you put your hand on it, it's not going to do anything. It's not going to be hot because your hand isn't made of metal. It's only going to heat up the metal. And so they're safer. They're less likely to cause a fire and these other issues as well. So induction cooktops, they perform well in terms of how quickly they can heat things up. They're safer and they reduce indoor air pollution. Resistance stoves are cheaper. And if that's your concern, you can certainly meet any all-electric outcomes with that. I mean, they're certainly available and a viable option if cost is the first concern. Just cost comparison, induction cooktops are more expensive. What's the range? Somewhere $300, $500, maybe $1,000 for some high end. That'll depend also on whether you have, the full range, or if you have a separate stovetop and an oven in the cabinet, or however you have that set up. So some pretty high variability. Generally, induction is going to be a little bit more expensive, but we would also see a more positive consumer experience with the induction stove. And that's kind of the broad, kind of the broad benefit to induction versus resistance cooktops and how that happens. I mean, I think there's going to be running concern, right, about how we start selling homeowners on gas stoves, right? If you have a neighborhood and you're building all electric and there's another neighborhood down the road and they're not, and they've got gas stoves, and someone comes into your house and says, well, why can't I have a gas stove? That might not be a conversation you want to have. So, there's those benefits like we talked about. They perform well, they reduce pollution inside the home and outside the home. So you're going to kind of talk about kind of broader scale benefits to those. We don't really need to get in this. So the other thing that comes up when we talk about all electric homes is, are we going to be able to fit all that stuff into the panel in the garage, right? Is there enough room? Is there enough electricity coming into the house? Is there enough electricity in the neighborhood? The general answer to that question is yes, there probably is enough. In some cases, you may want a sub panel, depending on whether you're thinking about having 1 or 2 EV chargers in the house, or whether you're thinking about having a battery in the house, and sub panel may be the way to handle that. Whether you need to go above a 200 amp panel is going to come down to the size of the house. So far what we've seen is generally, as long as you don't have 2 EV chargers and your house is less than 4,000 square feet, you should be able to get away with a standard 200 amp panel. If you have a very big house and you have more than 1 electric car charger installed, then you may need that 400 amp. Now, how much more expensive is it? It's not, I mean, it's about twice the cost, right, of the panel, but in total, we're talking about a cost difference of maybe, $700–900. We don't have reason to believe so far that electric infrastructure in the neighborhood needs to change. Edison and PG&E have both told us that the existing lines and transformers should all be able to handle that, because we have this whole part of, the solar panel is dumping a lot of that electricity out, so not all of it is going out and back from the grid. But it's going to come up. Some engineers are going to think that you have to build for that bigger panel, and they're going to really want to drive towards that worst case sizing. And so that's a conversation to kind of be prepared for and just have in mind that may come as we make that transition. And this is something else that's just going to have to kind of settle as we see more people doing it. The all electric homes we see being built right now are being built with 200 amp plus 125 amp sub panel. That's what we've seen so far. We don't see anybody needing 400 as of yet. Indoor, I mean, we covered this with the gas cooking earlier. And this is a big part of what the state talks about when they talk about electrification, is improving indoor air quality. And it's true. I mean, it does reduce, not only does it reduce the absolute amount of pollutants in the home, but it reduces the potential for pollutants in the home. Whether that's a conversation you want to have with your customers, I don't really know, because you might be selling some of this and some of that, mixed messaging issues. But if you're looking to go all electric, there is a good argument to be made about the benefits that gives in terms of indoor air quality. But then there's also outdoor air quality, right? This is largely driven by climate change policy in the state. And I'm sure plenty of folks remember what LA looked like in the 90s, and it's just a big brown cloud. And it doesn't look that bad anymore. So these policies, they do broadly work. It's kind of the fits and starts in between that are the struggle. So yeah, PV sizing isn't changing. Technically, it'll change a little bit, but it shouldn't be enough that it actually changes the size of the systems you're installing. The new version of CBEC is using a different set of weather files than the prior version. And the reality is the state has gotten warmer. So the electric energy consumption of homes is a little bit higher now based on that. It's a marginal difference that you shouldn't notice, but there may be a couple of cases where that comes up. And if they do, that's why, because the state has gotten a couple of degrees warmer in the last 25 years. Batteries aren't required. There are some incentives for batteries out there. And there are a lot of customers that want them, especially up here in Northern California, where there are fire-prone areas. And that's another topic that comes up, this idea of resilience, right? If I have a gas stove and the power goes out, I can still turn my stove on, right? If I have a gas fireplace and the power goes out, I can probably still turn that on too. If my house is all electric, I can't turn anything if the power goes out. Well, if you put a battery in, maybe you can. And I know I live in El Dorado Hills on the other side of the lake from here, and I've definitely lost power from these public safety power shutoffs. And it's definitely inconvenient. And the number of generators in the neighborhoods around me skyrocketed, right? People want that resilience. They want to know they're going to be safe and comfortable when the power's out. And batteries are a good way to deliver that. They save some money on energy bills. They probably don't pay for themselves. It's close, but like the lifetime, the battery maybe saves $8,000 and costs $10,000, about that scale. Which is why it's not a requirement, because they're not cost effective. They don't pay for themselves, but they pay a lot of it back, and they offer a lot of benefit in terms of this resilience, comfort, safety thinking, and they're becoming a lot more available. We've seen the availability of batteries come up a lot in the last 2 years, especially following these public safety shutoffs. Tesla has ramped up theirs, Sunrun, SunPower, both ramping up the availability of their battery systems. And the other thing to have in mind is that there is a requirement for large commercial, non-residential applications to have some battery storage. And so they did find a way to make it a requirement in the non-res code for this code cycle. And given that they did that, and given that batteries have become more available and the price is coming down, there is a good chance that they may become a requirement in 2025. So another thing to keep in mind, if the price comes down even just a little bit, because it only needs to just pay for itself, right? It just has to be a cost benefit ratio of 1:1. And as soon as it is, I would expect them to throw that in there.
Tom found that credit still exists in 2022.
Yeah, the credit's definitely still there. And the other thing to keep in mind if you're using batteries is different utilities have different benefits and different rate programs for batteries. There are, benefits to having, letting the utility company have access to the battery. When you do that, the homeowner loses a lot of that resiliency benefit, but the utility company will pay you more for it. And in that case, it may pay for itself. So there's a financial benefit to those arrangements. So you'll want to check with your local utilities if you're thinking about putting batteries in, because that'll get a little complicated. And maybe that's something you just leave off to the battery and solar providers, and you just have it as an option. But we have a question on that.
So Brian Wonkert asked, won't modeling electric appliances increase the PV sizing?
No, it won't, because the way they set up the baselines is if you build the all-electric house, it's actually going to assume for the size of your solar system that you have gas appliances. So the sizing of the PV is going to be based on the electric demand of a gas-based house. That's the way it's set up right now. It could change for the next code cycle, but for the time being, it won't impact PV sizing. Batteries. Yeah, they're not quite there on savings. That will change, I think. I think utility companies are going to be willing to pay more to get access to those batteries to become more available, especially if, in situations where you have a neighborhood and you can sell all the batteries in that neighborhood to a utility company, that could become very valuable to them. And we've seen some demonstration projects and grants trying to set that up and see if it works. So something to keep in mind in the future that may come. Just some examples of existing all-electric developments. Horton, K-Hog, some of the folks. So Horton's got one here in Sacramento, South Sacramento, that went up in SMUD territory. They got a bunch of money from SMUD to do that. Their homeowners are saving money. That was a pretty straightforward project. So if you're in those places where there's money available and you want to get ahead of, what we see coming this 2025 code, there's some opportunities to save money. If you already have gas infrastructure in the ground, then you're not going to save a ton, obviously, because you already paid for the gas lines. But something to think about when you're looking at land development, whether purchases or anything else is, do we need gas here? Like, is this something we're going to want in the future? And the state doesn't want you to do it. I mean, I'm going to put it like that is the state doesn't want to see any new gas lines going out anywhere anymore. And there may not be a direct incentive for that, but that's the outcome they want to get to, and that's what they're going to push for. Another example, townhomes, all electric. The idea here being, these homes they're doable, they perform well, as far as HERS ratings go, EDR scores go, then they're viable. I mean, the cost difference, the folks doing it first are the ones that are going to end up paying more because they're covering that learning cost. They're figuring out how to do it. They're paying it before the cost of appliances come down. And that's already happening. Folks are out there doing that. Some are getting some of the subsidies. Some are getting access to state grants. There is money out there for that stuff, and there will be more coming. Right now, the state has the build program going on, and that's subsidizing heat pumps. It's targeted at low-income housing, but if they don't get enough, so it's $200 million for 3 years. If they don't get enough low-income homes enrolled, then it'll become available for just market rate new construction homes. And so that's about a year or two out to see. And that might be something like $3,000 or $4,000 per home to put heat pumps in. So that's something else to keep an eye on. More examples. And these are some higher density stuff in Southern California and getting some incentives and some support from SCE. Some Z&E projects. Those are doable too. I mean, there's often money available when you're going to go to that above and beyond level of, zero net energy and all electric and really get there. And we saw with the Tejon Ranch project in Southern California, they had to go way out because they had this really long drawn out fight to get their CEQA mitigation agreed to. And so they committed to zero carbon homes. So they're going to be all electric and they're going to be building those for quite a while. But they're still going to make money on them. I mean, they're still viable projects and they're not losing by doing that.
There's one more question.
Sure.
So Nicole Falloon asked, NEM 3.0 is set to increase fees and reduce credits for solar production. Is anyone talking about this?
Yeah, kind of. I don't know if you all saw the email that went out from Dan Dunmore, CBIA, last week. He touched on it. It's tricky. So the thing of it is that, NEM 3 is going to make solar more expensive. Full stop, right? How much more expensive? Well, right now, a lot more expensive. $8 per kilowatt per month. So if you got a 3 kW system, that's $25 a month to have that solar that you're not paying right now, right? So that's $300 a year that you're going to add to that person's utility bills, right? And this goes into, it's phased in over 3 or 4 years. And the NEM, right, the net energy metering credit that you get for energy sent back to the grid, that's also being reduced. So the impact of this, so right now, if you put solar panels on your house, and we talk about that payback period, right now you put them on your house, that payback period is somewhere in the 9 to 12 years, right, before those solar panels start paying you back. If NEM 3.0 goes into effect as proposed, there will no longer be a payback for solar. It's just going to be a flat wash in 20 years. There's no savings. Is there a cost? No, not really. Again, it's going to be a wash after 20 years. What is that impact does it have on builders? What impact does it have on buyers? Well, if you're selling lease systems on your house right now, you just keep doing that. You don't worry about it. You let the solar folks do it. It's a requirement to have them on there. But yeah, it's a significant issue. It will absolutely increase the cost of solar on the homes. It may have the flip side it has the intent, right, to encourage more people to put batteries in the homes to make batteries a more viable financial option. Whether that works isn't entirely clear yet. They're still early in this rulemaking process. But yeah, it's definitely going to make solar more expensive. And there really isn't any buts to that. Whether to push back on that, whether we agree or disagree with that, that gets tricky too, because there are a lot of the arguments that are built into why NEM is changing is the idea that if you have a new home that's got solar on it, it's connected to the electric grid, it's not taking much energy from the electric grid. They're maybe paying, $50 a month to PG&E, right? But you have an old home that's being rented by somebody that can't afford to buy a home. They're already consuming more energy in total, and they don't have solar, so they're paying 4 times as much for their energy as the person with the new home, because they're paying more and they're using more energy. But the way we pay to support the electric grid, right, is based on the amount of energy you consume. So that older home with the poorer family is paying much, much more to support the electric grid than the person in the new home. And that's the idea behind the change in NEM, is to flip that balance. So it's not so much of a burden on low-income folks that can afford solar. And that's just where that argument is falling. So obviously the solar industry is pushing back against that very hard. They're very concerned. I mean, the idea that there's no longer a financial benefit to putting solar on your house, that basically ends the secondary market, right? That nobody's going to put solar on existing homes with that change. It won't make sense. I'm not sure that CPUC realizes how strong the impact is just yet. This is only an initial proposal, so we're just kind of a wait and see at this point to see how bad it gets, but that is where it stands right now. So otherwise, that's basically it. Edison has some resources to support energy efficient choices and programming for all electric. If folks are interested and you have, other, if you're building down south or you have other parts of your business that you can reach out to us and we can help you get connected into their kind of network of stuff. It's not a lot of money right now, but like I said, that's changing, and there may be a good chunk more if the build program goes the way it looks like. There are examples of all electric homes if you want to go see them. A lot of utilities have this, not just Edison. I know SMUD does too, and I think and Sonoma Clean Power does. But basically, you can get a hot plate, right? You can get an induction hot plate, and you can just put it right next to the existing stove, and you can see how much difference it makes. The big thing is it boils water like in 2/3 the time of the gas stove, which is actually really impressive when you think about like a basic cooking thing, that it can actually boil water faster. I mean, when does that happen before? Like that actually does that. So it's pretty neat from that perspective, and the whole like being able to put your hand on it and it's not warm. With that, questions, comments, diatribes?
So in general, historically, I've always heard that the cost more to run all electric heat and everything like that. So how's that now with the heat pump equipment that's out compared to heating your home with natural gas and just heating your home with
It's still mostly true, but it's not as bad as it used to be. So it used to be, right, if you were talking about running a house with all electric and you had electric resistance baseboards, you might be paying 2 or 3 times as much if you had natural gas. If you're putting in a heat pump, you're talking about fractionally more, right? You're talking maybe $10 or $20 more a month on your bill. And that's for the winter months, right? In the summertime, it's not changing because an air conditioner is an air conditioner.
Right.
And that's basically what it shakes down to. The colder it is where you live, the more it's going to cost you. So if you're up in like Redding or something, there's a bigger impact than if you're in, say, San Jose or San Diego. In those mild climate areas, the difference on your bill, it might be $40, it might be none. If you're, like I said, if you're in SMUD territory, you'll save money because their rates are just that cheap.
Your PG&E and your rate.
I didn't say that. It is a little rougher if you're in
Well, what
PG&E.
if you're like in, Auburn or Tahoe area or Colfax,
If you're in Tahoe, an all-electric home doesn't make sense. It's not going to. What you're going to want to do, the thing you can do, the thing that the state has tried to push, and it's not a terrible idea. It's a little more expensive, but you can get a dual fuel heat pump. So essentially you get a furnace and a heat pump combo unit. And the idea here is that when the air temperature is mild, it'll use that heat pump when the heat pump is really efficient. And then when it gets cold, when the heat pump starts losing efficiency, it switches over and starts burning propane. And that way you kind of get the best of both. But it's a more expensive unit, and the propane probably would have been cheaper than using the heat pump at all. How does that change? How does the state get all electric up there? Not entirely clear. There is some movement to just start to find renewable fuels, right? If we had, propane that was created using hydrogen from solar and methane captured from manure and, was renewable, theoretically, a renewable fuel can actually be negative carbon, because if methane goes in the atmosphere, it actually has 70 times the global warming potential of carbon dioxide. So if you can avoid methane going up, you get bonus points. So maybe renewable fuels are an option, but or maybe it just gets more expensive to live in the mountains. I don't know. Wood is not a terrible choice up there. I mean, wood creates a lot of particulate emissions, which you can avoid with a pellet stove. Those can be pretty clean. So that might be, a driving option. But there's not a lot of production homes up there. You're talking about just, single custom builds. Auburn is further down the hill. So yeah, I think there's the potential for the all electric there. And it just, and that's, as you get into the hills, you're looking at more like $300 or $500 more a year on those utility bills. I mean, that's what the state policy is. If they find ways to level that out, to even that out, I don't know. There isn't anything there yet. It's just the reality of it for now.
In terms of compliance, right? Right now we're in 2019 code.
Yep.
Once we jump into 2022 code, have you run any models like just grabbing a typical home in Sacramento, seeing what the ER impact is on the 2022 code? Does that make sense? So,
yeah, it's not a lot. I mean, the big thing is the heat pump change. This is the thing that CBIA fought really hard for, was to not have any significant changes. So there are no significant envelope-based performance changes. The biggest changes to the performance are in those updated weather files, which show the warmer climate. So the potential credit for a higher efficiency air conditioner is a little higher. So you might start looking at 18 SEERs a little more often. But apart from that, it's just going to be that question of, okay, climate zone 12, I need a heat pump water heater. Can I trade this off? No, probably not. That's really going to shake out.
from the emissions from ER1 perspective.
Right. Yeah, and an ER2, because ER2 is based on TDV, right? It's based on this, what is the impact to the grid equation? And in terms of the impact to the grid equation, the gas still does better. So the gas is still going to win a lot of the times in the EDR2 score, but it's never going to win the EDR1 score. Yeah. And you have to meet that.
And as far as you have to meet those, so in other words, I can't go negative ER1 and
Yeah.
still comply.
No, you can't trade off between them.
Okay.
Yeah. They made sure.
Someone asked another question. I have heard no changes in the entry door and window heat factor and solar heating coefficients for 2022. Or does this depend on certain climate zones?
Right. Yeah. Envelope windows. That's staying the same for the time being. again, that was the big fight. We don't want. I mean, it comes down to this whole, what is the cost of building a home, right? And everything they do is because they love to create these measures that are this 1-to-1 payback ratio. But at the end of the day, a payback period or a cost benefit ratio of 1 means that you're adding upfront costs with the lifetime savings, which fundamentally means you're increasing the cost of the house. They don't like to acknowledge that. And that's just kind of the way the code is made. I think, and I've talked with Bob and Chris at CBA, and we've put a lot of thought behind like, how do we get ahead of that? How do we make a better argument in terms of avoiding those things that have that higher upfront cost with the lifetime savings? Because it really comes down to what's the cost of buying a home, because it's a lot easier to worry about your utility bills later when you've already been able to buy the house. If you can never buy the house, then you don't even get to think about what your utility bills are. And if you can't buy the house in the first place, you can't sell the house in the first place, the housing market remains constrained and people remain stuck. So it's bad policy to make homes more expensive. It's the real point. So.
I haven't put too much thought into this, but what kind of things, we talk about measures that are going out. Just switching from, basically tankless water heaters gone for the most part in terms of negative. At the same here with furnace,
Right.
gas furnace. Is there anything out there that's going to benefit in terms of, aside from these, odd methane collectors or something like that, but just from I haven't even.
Or the things that are going to help you get a EDR1 boost.
Yeah.
Battery might. I don't know the sheer numbers on that. So if you think about a battery, right? So if a kilowatt hour, right, consumed from the grid emits, I'm making this number up, but if it emits 100 grams of CO2, right, and that grid is 50% clean, and a kilowatt hour from your rooftop solar emits 0 grams of CO2, right? If you have a battery that's making sure that you're not taking any of that grid energy in, then you're avoiding, right? That's the way you're saving emissions for a heat pump water heater. Is it enough? I'm not sure, but that it should have some impact. And again, solar thermal will help you get there. Don't see a lot of those these days, but
Yeah, well, things are going to be changing. It sounds like that's what I'm trying to.
Yeah, I mean,
when it comes to that, we're not really touching anything envelope wise. That's going to be in benefit.
yeah, envelope isn't going to help you with the water heater. I mean, it'll help if you're trying to fight the furnace, then the envelope will make a difference. But I mean, you're talking super tight, you're talking R60, you're talking R26 walls, you're 22 windows.
See, cost benefit.
No, it's an uphill fight at this point. That's what the policy is. You see, the gas companies are trying to push renewable fuels as an option, and it's coming in some. But the problem is that it's not available right now. And even if it becomes available, by the time it does, it's this whole likelihood, right, that builders will have already had to have switched to all electric, like before that renewable fuel becomes available. So that's a time will tell question. Because if the natural gas or the propane the house might have was 50% renewable, well, now you can compete on EDR1 because you have lower source emissions. When do we see that? Semper's going to try, right? SoCal Gas is going to try. Propane is trying. We'll see.
Another question. He asked, do you have any examples of a fully gas home compared to a mixed fuel home compared to an all electric home?
Well, when we say mixed fuel, we usually mean fully gas. So I think we had a couple back here. Now, when you just off that question, are we talking about compliance? Or are we talking about cost? Or what comparison are you interested in? Okay, so the top one is the basic code compliant house. So that's, I think, what you meant by mixed fuel is that you have a heat pump, water heater, and a gas furnace. And I think this is climate zone 9. So you see in EDR2, right, that house is right. So the top line compared to the bottom one, the gas house has the EDR2 score that's higher by about 5.5, and it has an EDR1 an emissions score that's higher by 13. So that's how much of a difference, right, in compliance having the heat pump water heater has. That's the gap you'd have to make up. So making up a gap of 5 EDR points is doable. It's gonna take quite a bit, but it's doable. But making up a gap of 13, good luck.
There's another question. When is NEM 3 supposed to go into effect? Should we be telling our builders, or will it most likely just affect existing homeowners? And do we have to include heat strips when we're modeling the home?
So the heat strips are already baked in, so you don't have to worry about them. The way CPEG will do that is based on local climate. It'll figure out the likelihood that those heat strips get turned on, and that'll be baked in based on which appliance you chose. And that's based on appliance and appliance efficiency. So there's this whole NEA rating system for the heat pump water heaters that checks for that. And similarly for the furnaces. What was the first part of the question?
The first one is, when is NEM 3 supposed to go
when
into
is NEM
effect?
It could be soon. So if the policymaking goes straight ahead and the resistance doesn't take hold, then we could see it enacted, in 2022. So we could see it enacted maybe summer next year, and then it gets phased in from there over, I think it's a 4-year period. For builders, if you're selling homes and you're buying the panels and putting them on the home and including that as part of the sale price of the home, well, I mean, it's still not changing anything, right? The solar panels still cost the same. What's changing is what the buyer is going to pay on the utility bill. So it's not impacting how you're building and selling the home. It's changing what the buyer's utility bill is, and it's going to bump their bill up by $25, $30. And that's what that impact is going to be.
There's another question. Do you happen to have examples with climate zone 11, 12, and 13? Are the compliance, the margins about the same for climate zone 9?
No, they're going to be bigger, right? Climate zone 9 has a low heating demand. So like 12 and 13 have pretty high heating. So you're going to see a significantly larger delta in terms of performance. Yeah, because you're just going to have a lot higher gas usage in that base case house. So again, but that's actually why the requirement is for a heat pump water heater in climate zone 12 and not a space heater, because it's a lot easier to because the difference for the water heater is so much higher, or for the space heater is so much higher, and the water heater is cheaper. So that was theoretically CEC trying to take it easy on us up north. But
next question. Do you have a comparison between a single heat pump house, furnace or water heater, versus an all-electric house?
No, but if we look at like the example that's here, you would just you would look at the EDR1 and you just assume basically double the benefit with the all-electric house. So if with one heat pump, right, the EDR1 score is 37. If you have two, then your EDR score is going to look more like 25 in that category.
Next question, Scott McKay asked, if you oversize PV to 100% usage offset, will the models allow for more gas appliances in the compliance calculations?
No, because no matter how much solar you put on the house, you're still gonna be consuming the same amount of gas. And that's what you have to offset is the emissions from the gas. And not offset, you have to reduce, right? Offset is the wrong word. You have to reduce the emissions from the gas. And you can do that with solar thermal. You can do that with a battery because it changes the energy that's being, well, that changes. No, you can't do it with battery. The battery doesn't affect a gas water heater. But yeah, you can do it with solar thermal for a gas water heater, and you can do it with envelope improvements for a furnace. But that's basically it.
Next question, how does this help housing affordability?
Well, yeah, that's kind of what I was saying is it's probably not helping housing affordability. In places where the electricity is cheap, it helps, right? So in Sacramento, it helps because the electricity is cheap. In PG&E territory, where the electricity is the most expensive and covers the colder parts of the state, it's increasing the cost of the utility bills. How is it impacting the cost of building the home? Well, it's probably going to reduce the cost of building the home. So, like, let's put that into a net benefit comparison, right? So if building the all-electric home gets you, let's say 5, we'll be generous. We'll say it saves you $5,000 building the all-electric home because you're avoiding the gas infrastructure. You don't have venting and you don't have those things. So you save $5,000 on the cost of building the house. And then you're going to add $300 a year to the utility bills, right? So that's $3,000, 10 years, $6,000, 20 years, $9,000 mortgage period, right? So, it costs more in the long run, but, gas isn't going to be available in 30 years. So, it kind of becomes a moot point there. So by the time it becomes more expensive in the long run, you lose the ability to get gas in the first place. So it can probably reduce the cost of building the home, and the net impact to the utility bill over the lifetime is probably going to end up being negligible because of the way the state's managing energy policy.
Next question, can you get credits for removing heat strips?
I don't think so. There are I think I'll have to check. I should write that one. Well, we'll save the questions. I'll have to look back at that. I think there are some choices, some particular products that don't have them that you can choose, but there's not a toggle to just turn it, not have the heat strips that I'm aware of. So we can look into that.
Next question, are there any incentives to build a house all electric versus doing a single heat pump?
Well, so in SMUD territory, there are, and so like I said, this build program from the state will provide that. It's a first come, first serve. So it's a pool of 200 million, probably coming available next year. It'll be somewhere $2,000 to $5,000 a house. We don't know yet. We're still designing it. So there may be some money available to make that choice. So something we'll want to keep an eye on. We'll keep an eye out for that. And if we see it, we'll make sure CBA knows.
He clarified in terms of compliance credit or incentives, compliance credits for an all electric house versus a single heat pump.
Well, yeah, the all-electric house is going to do better on EDR1 and EDR2 in most cases. I mean, you can see the one on the screen. Just having one heat pump is getting you 6, EDR points as we know them now, right? EDR2 is EDR as we know it today. So one heat pump is getting you 6 points. So 2. If you put 2 in, that might be enough to go back to a 2x4 wall. So there is a compliance credit there.
Next question, Scott McKay asks, has there been any discussion of jurisdictions pushing off requirements for communities that have already installed gas infrastructure?
No. That's, yeah, they're not thinking of it in terms of that. They're just thinking of trying to get you to do natural gas and then trying to avoid new lines from getting installed. And they're trying to find ways of getting rid of old gas lines. That they haven't gotten much traction on, but they're definitely thinking about it.
Next question. All of the HVAC manufacturers will be retesting their equipment soon, and lower values are expected for CR2 and ER2. Was this taken into account for cost?
No, the cost is just based on what's available right now.
Has there been any feedback from heat pump water heater manufacturers about being able to support the demand?
They say they're gonna. I mean, we've talked to Ream and A.O. Smith, and they're pretty upbeat. Obviously, they're gonna sell a lot of water heaters, but they seem pretty confident that they'll be able to meet demand. I don't think that they're gonna fail to meet the demand. I would just expect a hiccup, right when the requirement comes into play. And, that's the thing I would be ready for. Because, the market's gonna shift where it has to shift to. It's just being ready in case there's a bump there. But so yeah, think about seeing a bump in that availability first 6 months of 2023. After that, I think things will be pretty well settled.
And would the NEA requirement still afford an additional compliance credit?
Yeah, you'll still get additional points for going with the NEO water heater.
Let's have another question. Has there been any conversation, not necessarily in the immediate future, about enabling instantaneous electric water heaters to be able to be compliant?
They don't want to. They're less efficient. They use up a lot more energy. The heat pump water heaters are just they're cheaper than doing the instantaneous version. They perform better, and they use less electricity. So whether that becomes an option, it's not clear. But I don't think they want it to be an option. If the product's available, so like an instantaneous electric water heater will pass EDR1, but it may not pass in an EDR2 scenario because it's going to add a lot of energy use to the house. So it just might not be a viable choice. Any other questions come up, you can of course reach out to us at ConSol. I'll put my email back on the screen. We'll keep following this as we always do. It's where the world's heading right now, and California is obviously going to lead that road because California feels very much the need to do that. But the opportunity is really being ahead of it. Is being ahead of what we know is coming, getting those costs down ahead of time, being ready for it, not being surprised. And if you know it's coming and you know there might be some money, you can be ready to grab onto some of those subsidies if they become available. So with that,
We have one last question. On it.
sure, go for it.
All right. Should we expect CVEC modeling for heat pump water heaters to be similar to how it is now, primarily by model, or is CVEC going to implement a new way to model based on efficiency?
We don't have word on any change to that, and I wouldn't expect that to change.
Another question. Are utility companies anticipating solar farms to be the norm for new communities in the upcoming code cycle?
That's a tricky question because with the whole NEM 3 thing, the whole idea is utilities, they want to have a monopoly on the solar development. They don't want it going on homes. They want it going in at utility scale. So we may see more of what SMUD's done with the solar shares program, which if you all don't know is an option for solar where you just call up SMUD, say, I want some of your solar. And they say, okay, you can have some. And then you write that down in your compliance and then you don't have to put solar on the house. And then the homeowner gets a $10 bill credit because you did that. It's the only place in the state that has that available. It just passed the CEC earlier this year. There's a big fight about it because again, the rooftop solar folks didn't want it to pass. So we may see that expand. So community solar. So the SMUD program is called SMUD Solar Shares. So if you're in SMUD territory, you can look that up.
There's another question. I'm not sure which measure she's referring to. I asked her to clarify, but she asked, is there any time to push back on some of these measures?
No, the code was formally enacted last week. So that's kind of done. I would say, so like I mentioned earlier, you know, the code development for 2025 is starting right now. So that's the thing we can push back on, or you can push back on. But yeah, no, as far as 2022 code is concerned, it's done.
And if anyone has any more questions, feel free to email Tom Payne@consol.org, or I can also leave my email at consol.org, so you guys can go ahead and send me any questions you have, and I can get back to you guys.
Well, we'll just leave that up for a minute, but thanks for everybody.
All right, thank you,
Being in
Tom.
person.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for being out.
Appreciate it.
Yep. Of
Take care.
course.
Have a great day, everybody.
Y'all too.